Let me tell you a story about a region full of dynamism, intellect, and energy, but afflicted by troubles in recent times. A global pandemic crippled economies, strained healthcare, and brought hardship to many. A distant war caused food and energy insecurity and rapid inflation. A volcanic explosion destroyed homes and crops. And a climate crisis continues to cause storms, floods, and droughts. The pressure of managing these multiple crises has slowed development and worsened gender inequality. Yet despite these troubles, there are solutions from within the region and beyond. Now, we shift our mindset from being stymied by the challenges to devising practical, workable measures for overcoming barriers to our progress. Solutions on all sides, addressing multiple crises to end gender inequality in the Caribbean. Let's write the next chapter of this story, starting now.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, those joining us here in person and of course, our family joining us online. As we close the bank's 53rd Annual Board of Governors meeting, we are indeed delighted to welcome you to our flagship gender seminar, Solutions on All Sides, addressing multiple crises to end gender inequality. I am your moderator, Daniel Best, Director of Projects at the Caribbean Development Bank. We are holding this dialogue as the world faces instability in the global political economy, growing inflation, a food and energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, escalating climate change, and worsening poverty. What do all these issues have to do with advancing gender equality? This afternoon, as good Caribbean people, we will share stories about our current reality, highlighting our vulnerabilities as SIDS and the persistent inequalities. But as we reflect on these gaps, we will also share solutions, opportunities, potential, and of course, the resilience of our people. We have quite an experience for you this afternoon with lots of issues to unpack. To help me do this, I am delighted that we have an expert panel. Joining me on stage is Judith Wedderburn, an international gender justice and climate change expert. Dr. Halima Deschamps, Senior Lecturer and Head, Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Nita Barra Unit at the University of the West Indies Cayfield campus. Ms. Michelle Irving, Executive Director, National Women's Commission, Belize. Nicole Peter-Patterson, International Gender and Trade Expert. And Tamara Huggins, Director of the Women's Voice and Leadership Caribbean Project for the Equality Fund. We also have a special segment in this seminar. We're being extremely innovative this afternoon. We have a virtual solutions room, and my co-moderator, Tony Brobber, UN Women Multi-Country Office Representative, will lead that session. To get us started, however, please join me in welcoming my boss, our Vice President of Operations and Gender Champion for the Caribbean Development Bank, Mr. Isaac Solomon, to officially welcome you on behalf of the bank.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, our panelists and solutions room, our audience and online participants, CDB colleagues, welcome and good afternoon. This is the last, but by no means the least, of the seminars put on by the Caribbean Development Bank on the occasion of our 53rd annual meeting here in beautiful Saint Lucie. I'm showing off that I know some Creole words. After all, I live here for 8 years, addressing multiple crises to end gender inequality. While it is not unusual for the world to be experiencing a crisis of one kind or another, we are indeed facing what the World Economic Forum calls a polycrisis, the interaction of present and future global risks. Elevated food and energy prices, the extremes of climate change, and inequalities are just some of the scenarios constituting this medley of crises. And we must not forget how important it is to level the playing field for women as we tackle the multiple crises. Because if we neglect to do this, these tumultuous events will seriously affect our societies and slow down poverty reduction efforts. We cannot take any gains for granted. Even as I speak, efforts to tackle gender inequality are under threat. Simply put, we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Targets or any development objective without ensuring that gender equality is a priority. If gender equality and women's empowerment are not placed in the center, we are limiting how bright our future can be. Progress in sustainable development is stymied by gender inequality. So, to be fully successful in reducing poverty, gender inequality and women's empowerment have to be seriously pursued. If not, so much is at stake. This is of overwhelming importance. Tackling multiple crises means that you always have to be innovative, consistently committed, and moving together to solve challenges, to pool efforts and to draw on each other's expertise, convening power, and capacity to be agents of change. I must also say something about the kind of leadership that is needed in the face of multiple crises. Heads of state and other leaders must prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable, and they must be bold in being at the front line of calling for and opening up the way for women's empowerment. Multilateral development banks like the CDB have a significant role to play in partnership with the private sector, civil society, and government. At the CDB, our priorities, investments, and collaborations to lead the promotion of gender equality are guided by a comprehensive gender equality action plan that we take very seriously. We became a regional catalyst contributor through our investment in the Portland Equity Fund 3 to support private equity operations in the region and promoting broad-based economic growth for women-owned MSMEs and gender-responsive social development. CDB also recently became a member of TWEX Global, a global industry body that convenes the spectrum of investors to promote gender lens investing. Our investment in the Portland Fund and membership with TWEX Global positions the bank as a leading champion that will contribute to the establishment of an ecosystem to advance gender lens investment in the Caribbean across every sector. Lastly, I am proud to say that CDB is in the process of advancing a knowledge exchange lab, a space where individuals, groups, and organizations can share local and indigenous tools, lessons learning, and advance innovative practices in gender equality from the Caribbean. The solutions from today's event will be channeled into this initiative. Our experts today have an important task of opening up our minds and pointing us towards some major solutions and concrete actions. We have a history of transformative and groundbreaking thinking, activism, and action in this region. Let us build on this. It is our desire that all will leave this seminar with something for the future to be advocates for positive change that ends gender inequality. I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Isaac, certainly for reminding us of the importance of looking forward rather than backward as we seek to advance gender equality, and also for pointing out the ways in which CDB has been leading and being a champion in advancing gender equality in our region. I now have the pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, of introducing the Honorable Minister of Public Services, Home Affairs, Labor and Gender Affairs for St. Lucia, Dr. Virginia Albert Poyo, to bring us warm welcomes to this seminar.
Good afternoon, one and all. I want to adopt the protocol that has been established and take this opportunity to welcome you to St. Lucia. I know most of the delegates here have been welcomed and you have been enjoying some of the goodies that we have to share in this island. However, this afternoon, as we speak to the issue of gender, it is a very important item on the agenda. And with this, I bring you warm greetings from the Prime Minister, who you have had the pleasure of sharing some time with, my cabinet colleagues, and the people of St. Lucia, to our beautiful Helen of the West. Our gathering this afternoon is not by mistake. It is by design, because the issue of gender is one that is of critical importance to us in the region, and especially in St. Lucia. And as the minister with responsibility for gender, I have certainly tried my best to put gender on the agenda. And I am very pleased that my Prime Minister and my cabinet colleagues have fallen in line, and they too are very sensitive to the gender issues in St. Lucia. I say this in light of a number of initiatives which this government has taken so far, where about a year ago, we passed the famous domestic violence bill in St. Lucia, which has taken flight in the region and also globally. We have also established gender focal points in every single ministry, and we are also looking at gender mainstreaming in every government's program. I know the Caribbean Development Bank has gender on its agenda, and when they do look at their programs, they look at the issue of how gender can be included. Now, many of us think gender is about women, but gender is not about women. It's about men and women sharing equal space and opportunity in national development. And gender becomes a serious matter when we see one of the genders lagging behind. And anytime we enact laws and legislations and policies, we have to check to see which of the gender is to benefit from this policy or legislation. And I recall my experience about a year ago when we passed the domestic violence bill. The men accused me of passing the bill for women. And I said the bill was not for women. It was for both men and women, because both men and women are equally important in the legislation, and both of them stand to benefit from it. However, where the women stand to benefit most is because the majority of persons who experience domestic violence are women. So once you pass legislation to strengthen that situation and to prevent it, then women will stand to benefit more. As we look at the issue of solutions on all sides, addressing multiple crises to end gender inequality in the Caribbean, you are fully aware that we have had a number of challenges which have emerged of late. For example, we have just come out of the severe attacks and and consequences of COVID-19. We are actually facing the war in Ukraine, although we are not in the battlefield, but the consequences are right here at our doorstep. We have the issue of the recent volcanic activity in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the ongoing climate crisis that has reversed a lot of the gains that we had made in gender equality. And I attended a conference not too long ago in Taiwan. And before I attended the conference, I was informed that it would take us about 90 years to achieve gender equality. However, a further analysis was done, and the results were shocking, where it revealed that it will take us 135 years to achieve gender equality globally. So this is not just a joke. It's not a phrase. It's not a catchy moment for us to just glorify or celebrate or talk about. But these are real issues. It's real issues where either men or women are discriminated against or not given the space or the position around the table to have their voices heard in decision-making, in the use of resources and distribution of resources, and ensuring that every man and woman occupies the space that is designated for him or her in life. And any opportunity we get to advance gender equality, it is to advance development. And gender equality has created a serious setback for us in social development, in education, in economic development. And if we are able to achieve gender equality, we will see exponential results in development in our society. And notwithstanding the setbacks that we had with COVID and the other issues, if we take advantage of technology, we should move forward exponentially. And that is why I am very pleased to hear of the Caribbean Development Bank's program, where they include women, they include the opportunities for training, the use of technology, which will advance the cause of both men and women. I do not want to bash the men in the room, but I think you have to have respect for that particular statement that I have. They said, if you educate a man, you would have liberated an individual. But when you educate a woman, you liberate a whole nation. And I say this in the context that women are always accused of being the one who talks the most. They call it gossip. But for the men, they say they discuss issues. So, because women talk a lot, if you give them the skills and the knowledge, they will talk about it. They will share it with their children, with their family, and then it will move exponentially. So I am encouraging the Development Bank to ensure that we invest heavily in women, especially at the decision-making level, in the area of skills development and education, and we will see most of the things that we call challenges in the region will soon become solutions. And I thank you for this afternoon, and I look forward to the discussion we have there.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Indeed, we are grateful for your commitment and leadership in advancing gender equality, not only in St. Lucia, of course, but across the Caribbean. To set the context for our discussion today, Kishma Siria, a St. Lucian spoken word artist, will perform a call to action to ground our discussions today. Please join me in welcoming Kishma.
Good afternoon. Having followed Dr. Virginia Albert, I feel like I should just sit down. This piece is about stories that impact us. So it's called Once Upon Our Time. In typography, a margin is an area between the main center of a page and its edges. In trade and accounting, Margins speak of leverage and security, profits and loss. Margins represent a demarcation of a gap between one area and another. The marginalized are fully aware of this, and they know the feeling oh so well. The clear lines, the distinctions, the separations. They have suffered lacerations from razor-sharp edges of the lines between the haves and the have-nots. COVID-19 will go down as one of the most damaging times in global history. COVID-19 will go down as the greatest catalyst of change. COVID-19 is the black sheep of the family, the one who is tired of holding and housing individual and collective secrets, and now he is speaking and he reveals the inadequacies and the inefficiencies of our healthcare system. It has highlighted the prevalence of gender-based violence because home is where the fist is. It has exposed the fragility of employment as many families were thrust into abject poverty. This is a call to action. Like any strong Caribbean family, we must bind together. We must build together. We must make the necessary changes. We must open our eyes to the impacts of our global community. Before we can tackle the issue of climate change, we must change the climate that makes it acceptable to litter, to sandmine, and to disrespect the very earth that houses us. This is a call for accountability. Accountability for us and for those who are damaging us, our marine system, our ecosystem, our agriculture, our very livelihood. We have felt with basket empty alarm the effects of inflation from the Russia-Ukraine war. We know with frightening clarity the threat to food security. Small businesses have endured the increase in trade, in operating costs, in shipping costs, and technology continues to brag, exposing the gap of gender inequality. The cost to live is at crisis levels. And now that some of the most brilliant minds in the world are here in one room, let's bring it home and let's make the change. For the farmers who lost all of their crops due to flooding and their children's education is impacted because they cannot send them to school, let's take action. For the single parent who is constantly working, and even with 2 or 3 jobs, they have yet to experience the bliss when you have successfully made 2 ends meet. Let's take action for the region, for the countries, for you, for me, for the men, for the women, for us. Let's take action. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Kishma. I think the foundation has been laid. This is a call to action. Thank you. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us, before we jump in, take a quick deep dive of the run of show for this evening. We have our distinguished panelists here with us. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to present their lightning response to their question. Let me say that again slowly. Each speaker will have 3, not 30, not 30, not 30, Nicole. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to present. I know there's a lot we need to unpack this evening, but we're going to start with 3 minutes to present your response to the lightning question, and then we will move to our virtual solutions room before coming back into this room and then opening, of course, for our Q&A. So please have your questions ready as well. And we're going to begin with the climate crisis and gender equality. Judith, you're opening the innings for us this evening. Caribbean small island developing states are 7 times more likely to be affected by natural hazards. And our average damage per GDP is 6 times higher. This must have serious implications for progress towards gender equality. We had a groundbreaking loss and damage agreement at the most recent COP, but often gender is the missing link in achieving these goals. So Judith, tell us, what are the gender gaps in the region related to leadership for climate change, our approach to negotiations and climate financing, and please, how can we address these gaps?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I promise to do my best. 3 minutes, but time is of an essence. But I would like to say, thank you so much to everybody for showing up. We know that we are Caribbean islands, we are SIDS. We lack resources. But I'm putting on the table that our most important resources are our people. The women and men who are challenged in many different ways. And that is who I speak on behalf today. The women and men who are our most important resource. Okay, so Mr. Chair reminded us that Caribbean SIDS are 7 times more likely to be affected by natural disasters. And yes, a groundbreaking loss and damage agreement for vulnerable countries was agreed to at COP27.
Agreed.
We are challenged to ensure that gender does not remain a missing link in the work that needs to be done by our governments, by other governments related who are part of that agreement. We are challenged to ensure that gender does not remain a missing link in the process that they have to undergo to achieve the goal. So what are the missing links? The question speaks to leadership. Leadership where? I'm advocating it has to do with the leadership of those who are going to advocate on our behalf when we go to COP28. I guess it'll be the next one. What does that mean? It means that we are challenged to say, we challenge our governments to say, we are relying on you to come up with the best leadership team. The best leadership team.
Representative.
Team of women and men. And we are not about numbers, but we know we need both. I'm not advocating to have women just because we want women. But the gender balance, imbalance which exists has to be corrected. So the women who are already on the negotiating team or aspiring to be on a negotiating team have to be willing to know the gender work, to identify what is holding back countries like ourselves, what will hold us back if they are able to apply for some of this massive money to create opportunities to address the damages that our countries are going to face as a result of severe climate weather. What are those damages? Houses washed away, schools washed away. How do we help? How do we ensure that the leadership of our negotiating team has that front and center and said, yes, what we are going to do will ensure that the resources are used in ways which are gender equal, that families that need the resources to be able to build back better. Yes, build back better the houses and the communities that they had before the climate crisis hit. Because it's a crisis. The house is gone, the bridge is gone. How do we ensure that they can build back better? Not just the individual families, the country can build back better. And the gender, what I'm advocating is that our negotiating teams need to be particularly sensitive to what is to happen at the end. How will communities and families be able to use the resources? So sure, the negotiations are not complete. They're going to continue, but every step of the way, we are to challenge our governments and the persons who are negotiating on our behalf at the COP and anywhere else they meet and have these negotiations to say, we must build back better after, once you get the funds released as a result of the loss and damage.
So Judith, I want to thank you extremely for that. It might have been a little more, but you know, you are certainly in a flow there. And it provides an excellent segue to the other point, because you spoke about the importance of resources and how we use resources, and of course building what would be an all-star negotiation team going to COP. And it brings us therefore to the point of the economic empowerment of women. And Nicole, I want to turn to you for this one, because we often hear the story of Caribbean women doing well in education achievement indicators, and we see them all the time at CDB, but certainly there's another side to this story as it relates to the overall economic empowerment. So, Nicole, I want you to share with us, what is the situation in the region as it relates to advancing gender equality in the labor market and trade sector, and how do we become more innovative and apply a gender lens to address the multiple crises through our development, financing, and investments?
Okay. That's, thank you for my 13 minutes. I shall proceed. Thank you very much for the question, Daniel. You know, what is very clear is a number of dimensions with regards to the situation that we face across the region to advance gender equality and to address gender equality issues. And I'm just going to try and cover a number of aspects of that dimension. Let's start looking at our labor market situation. So if we look at the issue of labor market, we're looking at issues such as the presence of the gender pay gap, the realities of occupational segregation, and the constraints that are faced in women's entrepreneurship. And just to give you a bit of context, a recent study that was done by Capri, which is a research think tank out of Kingston, Jamaica, looked at the issue and found that on the gender pay gap issue, women actually are earning at the higher level of our the corporates and the top jobs at 61% of what men are earning. So that is a gender pay gap of 39%. Mm-hmm. We need to put that in context that is comparable to a global gender pay gap of estimated 22%. Now let's also put that within the context, as you said also to Daniel, vis-a-vis education, that over the past 30 years, I think we can see that there is consistently about 80 to 85% of our university graduates who are in fact women. Mm-hmm. So the question is, where are the women? Where are the women also within our public sector and in our private sector? Because you also spoke, Judith, to the issue of decision making. So where are the women in the decision making and in those leadership roles and in those leadership capacities? A lot has been said over the years in terms of the ILO report that was referencing that we have pretty good figures in terms of women being in middle management in Jamaica, as an example again, and St. Lucia also has been highly recognized for that. But some of the work that I've been doing also has been looking at the gap between 59%, and in case of St. Lucia, it was indicated as 70% of women in middle management, to a reality of 7%, and this is some research that was done by Deloitte, 7% of women at the board leadership level in Jamaica, 22% in Trinidad and Tobago. So what happens between that 59% to that 7% vis-a-vis where the women are not adequately represented? And we see metrics that have been set in other parts of the world. So we're not the only ones that have work to do. So metrics that have been set, for instance, as in France and in some of the other EU countries where they set targets of trying to achieve like 40%, 30%, 40%. On the other issue that I touched on in terms of women's entrepreneurship, it's very clear that women's entrepreneurship as a targeted focus is a means of economic empowerment. But some of the challenges that we continue to face are vis-a-vis access to finance, training, the need for networking, and business mentorship. Let me just touch on the issue of trade. What's the reality of our situation? So we hear from various data, some is showing by Caribbean Export Development Agency, 70 to 85% of MSMEs provide the economic base across the Caribbean region. In other cases, it's 99%. But we're seeing that 23% of those women businesses, of those are women businesses, and only 1% of them are getting access to financing. So I just put out some of that in terms of the context, and I know you'll come back to me to
certainly
join the solutions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I must say these are quite startling statistics. Another area that is particularly startling and one of the thorny and most vexing of issues that we face within the region is that of gender-based violence. We hear so much about it in the Caribbean, but still know very little about its prevalence. Halima, gender-based violence impact increases with every crisis, unfortunately. The climate crisis, the pandemic, the cost of living crisis everywhere in the world. What is the current situation as it relates to gender-based violence, and how can we build resilience through our planning to address this issue in a more proactive way?
Thanks for that question, and it's really great following from both Judith and Nicole, because I think that larger context of our political economy is very much so how we must understand the situation for gender-based violence in the region. And as you said, if we think about crises in terms of quarantine, the quarantine measures we've had to put in place for COVID, we think about displacement in relation to the explosive volcanic eruptions in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, shifts in the labor market, and the overall economic fallout that we've been seeing. Both inequalities amplify, and more specifically, gender-based violence increases. So I think here about sexual violence against girls and women, children, intimate partner violence against women, and the violence of homophobia and transphobia that also increase in times of crisis. And we think specifically about the experiences of persons with disabilities, migrant workers, who are minoritized and further marginalized sometimes because they are assigned illegal statuses. So we think about what it might mean for the livelihoods of families in agriculture and in fisheries, and particularly women in fisheries in times of crisis who take longer to recover. And listening to a group of women fisher folk in Barbados just last week, they talked about the fact that they know outside of available data that gender-based violence increases in these times when they are out of work and their partners are out of work as well. And we think about examples like the earthquakes in Haiti in 2010, when we saw an escalation of sexual violence against women and girls. We think about the 1980 structural adjustment period in Trinidad and Tobago, and more recently, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, and what this means in terms of escalation. And we could compare this, for instance, to recent surveys that were produced by UN Women, CARICOM, the IDB, and CDB, in which we have prevalence data now for 4 or 5 Caribbean countries, all of which exceed the global average of 1 in 3 in terms of lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence. So those are stark cause for concern, and you could find these data online. I think at the onset of the pandemic, we begin to see countries reporting these higher levels of violence, and we are talking here only of official reports. So for example, we see in Trinidad and Tobago the recorded incidents of official reports of violence increased by 119% just in the first period of the pandemic, and it tells us something about crises and the escalation. So in terms of resilience building to gender-based violence, I think it's really important that we if we are serious about resilience building to prevent and better respond to gender inequality and gendered violence, we have to take a hard look at strengths, opportunities, and resources to foster the kinds of structural, institutional, ideological changes necessary. So it's a serious reckoning with what we mean when we talk about gender and gender inequality. Not enough time to go into it, but happy to return to it. It also requires a commitment to start from the perspectives of those persons most likely to be harmed by violence. I'm talking here about women, girls, and gender non-conforming persons, to address these as social injustices and inequalities. I do believe that we have more to learn from examples of the analyses provided by organizations who worked from the 1970s and 80s, like Sister in Theatre Collective out of Jamaica, Power out of Belize, and Michelle could tell you a lot more about Power, Red Thread in Guyana, Red Roots SVG from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And so because solutions from all sides will require us sort of engaging women and women's civil society as well as LGBT organizations if we are talking about addressing gendered violence. And there should be no solutions devoid of their engagement. And why this is important is because we live in a Caribbean space where activist women and civil society are actually working on behalf of states. Right? We have so many examples of that in this room and wider. So those kinds of ways in which civil society...
Yeah.
3 minutes.
No, thank you. Your response, of course, is both troubling but very spot on. And of course, you've also started to do my job.
Okay.
Because our next two speakers, women's rights and community activism has been the engine for advancing gender equality in our region. Our next two speakers will seek to connect that. So that's actually quite a perfect segue. I was about to exchange iPads with you. But Michelle, let's look at indigenous women and vulnerable populations within the region. And these groups often face multiple levels of discrimination and are frequently excluded from decision making at all levels. We're pleased certainly to have you and to have many members of the region's indigenous populations here with us at the annual meeting. Tell us, how are indigenous women, persons with disabilities, and the elderly impacted by the crisis that Halima would have just spoken to, particularly in the informal sector and the care economy? How can they be better supported to contribute to sustainable development? How can they play their part in all of this that we're seeking to advance here?
Thanks very much. And I think that I want to just echo what my three other colleagues spoke about. So if we talk about indigenous women and people, we talk about people with disability, we talk about the elderly, we talk about those populations that have multiple vulnerabilities. And so they're vulnerable to gender-based violence. They're vulnerable to the economic situations. They're vulnerable to the climate situations. And I think one of the things that when we talk about a gap or a challenge, we need to see that many times these groups are invisible. And in that not being visible, they're not accounted for, they're not counted, not much is known about their experiences during, after, before any crisis. So a lot of times they're left to kind of fend for themselves in terms of they're doing what they need to do to survive. And so the challenge is for us to ensure that we have a more inclusive society and to ensure that we respect other groups, what they're going through. A lot of times when we talk about vulnerability, we tend to think of it as inherent, like they're just born that way. And we need to change our mindset because people are made vulnerable in situations. And during that vulnerability, they're made to, in some ways, come up with their own solutions. Sometimes with very little assistance in doing so. And we could think about COVID, for example, when the lockdown started. If you think about people in very rural areas, hard to reach communities, if you think about people who cannot physically, cannot see, cannot hear, cannot go out there and get something because of the disability. If we think about the elderly who sometimes do not have enough support, what sometimes have to happen is that creative solutions have to come around. Because how do you really and truly ensure that no one is left behind? It's a catchphrase. It's a good catchphrase. But for you to ensure that, it means that you have to have boots on the ground and you have to respect those boots, meaning that you have to respect the information that is coming from the person's lived experience. Because sometimes you will say, oh no, that can't be so. I don't find it so. That's how you find it. That's the way you find it. But that's not the way they're experiencing it. And a lot of times we tend to be a bit dismissive, especially in terms of the maybe development paradigm. We tend to think that we don't have time to waste on that. So if we talk about unpaid care work, for example, think about COVID and think about who had to do that unpaid care work at the risk of their very lives. It was the women, quite a bit so. They had to be the one taking care of the sick. They had to go to the hospital. They had to take food to the hospital. You know, well, I don't know, in Belize, you have to sleep with the one at the hospital. I think they kick you out during COVID, though. But anyway, you know, you have to take food there, take soup. You have to, you know, sometimes you cannot even participate in your informal work. You can't make the Johnny cake to sell because you're taking care of that sick person or that elderly person in time of disaster. Right now, we're on a storm watch, yes? Where are the elderly people? Who will get them and take them to safety? Where are people in the deep rural areas? Who will ensure that their lives, you know, they're in a safe space? Those who are unable to connect to technology, everybody, oh, well, there is an assumption that everybody have a cell phone, an assumption, and everybody knows how to use that cell phone to get information, an assumption again. So if you're disabled and you don't have certain tools to use it, who will ensure that you have the information? So how do we learn from civil society groups who have been able to, I like to use the word, infiltrate on the ground to ensure that you have that chain connection going on to get messages? So when they call me and they say, Michelle, how the old lady that live, like this is the hurricane people, the Nemo in Belize, how that old lady that I said, don't worry, she has a family member, she has already gone, she has a, how that next young older person, yes, we have to go and get her because that person doesn't have that support, you know. So, and this happened right along. How about languages? In countries where there are multiple languages, how do you pass on information to the indigenous communities in their language that they can understand and they can make decisions in their language? And do not feel that you're doing them a favor. It is your right to get that information in the way you're better able to understand. So there's quite a bit of things in terms of when we think about the challenges and the gaps, but I think within those challenges and gaps, there are the very solutions when we flip it the other side.
So thank you very much for that. Yeah, no. Absolutely powerful stuff. For me, certainly what jumped out at me there is, it hit me because no one left behind. I think we do say that a lot. It tends to be none of the people that we can see left behind. But there's whole sections of the population that we can't actually reach, and perhaps they're not getting enough attention and enough of our resources. Which then brings you to you, Michelle. Michelle, I work at a bank.
Mm-hmm. Tamara,
sorry, I said Michelle. Tamara, I work at a bank. Mm-hmm. And through your work experience, first with the state and also with the Equality Fund, what is your view on how we can continue to finance movement building to address the intersectional impact of these multiple crises? In other words, how can we get development financing to the persons that Michelle just spoke about? So share with us, Tamara, how do we get development financing to these people? What do we need to do?
I know my time is limited, and I'm really grateful to just share space with these women and everyone in the room. So I'll be brief and I'll look for your cue. But my mother always taught me that charity begins at home. So the solutions are right here in our countries and in our region. How do we do it? We do it collectively. We do it intersectionally. We do it together. The Caribbean, as you know, we're at the 53rd anniversary for this particular meeting of CDB. We have always had collectivity and intersectionality at the root. And we have always known that the solutions are on the ground. The solutions are at the grassroots. We are no strangers to crisis. We are no strangers to knowing that we have to respond to things that are externally driven and not caused by us, not brought to us, but that we have to come up with the ways to move it forward. So how do we look at our resources? There's a lot of discussion, especially within women's rights, that the resources are scarce. I personally do not believe that to be true. We know how to mobilize for COVID. We know how to mobilize when a hurricane or flooding or a disaster happens. We find the money. We find the money for the things that matter to us. So we need to find the money for human rights. We need to find the money for gender justice. It's here. Yeah? And so, as I said, again, my mom would say charity begins at home. If we want our governments to work, we have to work with our governments, and our governments have to work with us. We have to be innovative, as the panel has already said, in the solutions to move the resources to the movement. And I'll bring my dad into it too, because my dad would say, time and tide wait for no man. And so the time is now. How do we do it? We do it now. We do it immediately. We have to recognize that we are at a critical point in our region where we're still looking at an incredible gender pay gap. We're still looking at an absence of critical mass of women in leadership. We're still looking at women who are being abused at levels that are insane, for lack of a better word. It is unsustainable. The crisis is real, and the crisis is continuing. So the time for us to find solutions and to act on those solutions is immediate. And part of the work that I can say, reflecting on the incredible organizing that's always happened in civil society and at the grassroots, is that we're tired of hearing that the scarcity is the reason. I think that the absence of partnership is part of the reason. I think that also where we do not center the voices, as Michelle spoke so eloquently, centering the voices of those who are most affected. So we need solutions that are activist-driven. We need solutions that are community-driven. And those solutions are already happening right now. I believe that if you are experiencing a flooding in an agricultural-based or rural-based community, you don't deal with that alone. You're also going to help, as Michelle said, your elderly population. You're also going to provide the needs of a woman who's told you that she's facing family violence in the midst of that situation. So we cannot look at our crises as one by one by one. They're all linked and they're all connecting together. And part of the work that we're hoping to advance in the Equality Fund, I see the cue. Part of the work that we want to advance for the region and support what's already happening in the region is one where how do we create something here, create something for us and by us that reflects the realities that we've talked about, and I know that we'll talk about in the solutions room as well. Sure. And how do we essentially transform, because we're beyond the place of little and little, filling our basket. Our basket is big, huh? Yes, and it's time for us to be bold, it's time for us to be innovative, and it's time for us to really be transformational. And our women here and the folks in the room know very well that we have that energy. We've always had it in the Caribbean. We've always had it amongst our people. And it's time for the voices of those mobilizers at the grassroots level to be centered and come to the fore.
Thank you very much for that. Tamara, and apologies for the name flub earlier, but the absence of partnerships is certainly one that jumped out of me. And we find the money for the things we want to find the money for. I think that is true. Very, very true. It's perhaps an indictment on us bankers, us development bankers, but it is also very, very true. I know we are going to be moving over to the solutions room at this time, but before we do, and we're going to come back here, we're just getting warmed up. Surely this panel deserves another round of applause for the insights. Absolutely, for the insights. I'm up here, as I said, as a development banker and learning quite a bit from you all. So now, however, we are going to be moving to our young and dynamic solution room speakers. I should let you know that just this week, Sunday, the minister at my church called me a young father, but I'm not in the solutions room. I'm not that young. But anyway, and they've been listening and eagerly waiting to contribute. So at this time, let me hand over to my fellow moderator, Tony, to lead us in this segment. Tony, over to you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And it was such an amazing panel. Thank you to the panelists. Minister Albert Poyot, you see, we're discussing issues here. And I want to thank Mr. Solomon as well. The solution room is focused on the fact that we will not limit how bright our future can be in the Caribbean. We have Marissa Hutchinson, an environmental justice program officer with IRWA, Asia and the Pacific Caribbean people, young people across the world. Ashley Burnett, founder of Feminet, Caribbean and global advisor for the Frida Fund. Cavell Joseph, a consultant at the LAC Gender Innovation Lab with the World Bank, and Amilcar Sanatan, the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Gender Affairs in Trinidad and Tobago. So let's jump in with our solutions. Marissa, you first. The Bridgetown Initiative has laid the groundwork for how the global financial system can be reformed to better address the climate change and development issues that cities face. Now, as Tamara said, I don't think scarcity is our only issue, but how can Caribbean governments effectively integrate a gender lens to leverage the impact of international financing for women and men?
Thank you, Tony. I'll be very brief. So first, I'll speak on the COVID pandemic. So while it provided a glimpse of change and hope towards a more equitable and just world, it has intensified an already unimaginable impact of the climate events. So when we talk about addressing climate change, impacts on developing countries, especially loss and damage experienced by a small island developing states, a gender-responsive approach is encouraged, as it is likely to address and accommodate the unique needs of women, girls, and the other vulnerable groups that most speakers made mention of, whether it was Michelle or Dr. Halima Deschamps. And this is important in terms of preventing them from further marginalization. So in the Caribbean, we're aware that we have often encountered these tumultuous impacts, whether it's by tropical storms, which eventually evolve into Category 5 hurricanes, which often result in like very high winds, abnormal sea level rise, increased rainfall, and in many cases, inland flooding. And this also causes increase in temperature. But I think at some point we must admit that women bear the brunt of the impacts, and they're the key agents when it comes to response, relief, and recovery for their families, but also for the communities. So with regard to the Bridgetown Initiative, which was launched by Barbados's Prime Minister, Mia Motley, during the UN General Assembly in New York last September, which was prior to COP27, which was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. The initiative was proposed as a financial pact to be used to reconfigure and address the current international financial architectures to ensure that developing countries successfully are able to address debt and inflation, and more importantly, respond to, recover from, and prepare for climate disasters through additional and accessible concessions financing. Actually, in May, Barbados released an updated version of that Bridgetown Initiative known as Bridgetown Initiative 2.0. In the context of climate change, we understand that the intention of Barbados' government is to support developing countries in accessing grant-based funding to address the economic and non-economic losses and damages caused by extreme weather events and slow onset events. However, there's a concern, and we really must examine these things carefully to ensure that when we're using these financing paths or mechanisms, that we're ensuring that there isn't a heavier burden on the global south states, which they're already unable to carry and sustain. So in moving forward, my solutions would be to invest in building community resilience and their resistance against the effects of extreme weather events, and also invasive extractive industries, which we do have in some of our countries in the region, but also providing comprehensive access to women, girls, and other vulnerable groups and communities, whether it's to education, healthcare, innovative technologies. When it comes to the COVID pandemic, which has caused shrinking economies in the past, say, 3 years. We hope that international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, which remain rooted in neoliberal approaches, are basically interrogated, but also in a way held accountable for the way in which that they put additional debt on or continue to burden us developing countries, and again, more importantly, us SIDS. And then finally, having a very gendered
Marissa, I need you to give it quickly, that last solution.
a gendered approach to disaster risk reduction, mitigation, and adaptation, which is vital, because without that, we wouldn't have a very intersectional approach, which often collectivizes, but also prioritizes the meaningful engagement of women and all the other vulnerable groups in order to achieve gender equality and sustainable development. Thank you.
You got it, Marissa. You got it. You told us the gender responsive approaches, including women in the relief and recovery grant-based funding. You did it. Thank you so much in this time frame that we have. Ashley, Dr. Deschong spoke to a serious reckoning. What transformative approaches can we adopt to ensure that gender-based violence, and she outlined the very specific areas of gender-based violence as well and the way it's manifested in the Caribbean region, is addressed across regional development sectors?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. And I'm going to jump straight right into it. Firstly, to be truly transformative, it's really critical that we ensure that the interventions are inclusive and that they are in line with protecting the rights of all people, regardless of our personal biases and cultural tensions, which we know is very alive in the Caribbean. And so my proposal focuses on one particular solution, which looks at prevention through evidence-based and age-appropriate comprehensive sexuality education for young people. And whilst there is ongoing pushback against implementing CSE and a lack of political will to find alternatives, we can also commit to an interim strategy that focuses on out-of-school training and engagement for young people. And this also provides an opportunity to also engage parents and guardians in programming. And in order for this evidence-based and age-appropriate CSE to be effectively implemented at a community level, we have to use a whole community approach, which means we're using all facets of community to ensure that this is effective. And this really allows for the creation of brave spaces for young women and girls and the LGBT+ community to really understand and challenge gender norms and stereotypes, which causes street harassment, sexual violence, domestic violence to really be kept alive within this region. And we know that it leads to other forms of gender-based violence within schools, within the home, and also in other public spaces. But also implementing CSE helps to ensure that there is sustainable learning and positive outcomes, because we know that when it comes to reinforcement, that is also a part of how we're able to learn as a part of the home. And so it's really critical to have a robust and national regional response that provides tangible information that can debunk and curtail pervasive misconceptions on CSE curriculum, as well as to implement programs that tackle the root cause of gender-based violence, like as I mentioned, gender norms and stereotypes. Women and girls, people living in rural areas, and LGBT+ people belong to the most vulnerable groups in the region and also globally. And so it is of regional importance to ensure that we protect their rights and ensure that they are prioritized. There have been amendments to the HFLA curriculum to include a module on family violence. And I just want to say that this has been proposed to be amended. to facilitate behavior change that can contribute to preventative measures to end gender-based violence. However, this can only be successful if there's a unified approach and whole society movement to support this. But also looking on the other side of COVID-19, we have seen that digital solutions are quite possible. And so recently I was a part of a panel which created a space to give feedback to young people in other parts of the world who were a part of this year-long incubator for innovative solutions to address access to education and to challenge gender norms. And this incubator provided young people with technical and financial resources to help develop and implement their solutions, which is something I think that we can adapt here in the region. And finally, I want to encourage us to think about the various entry points for CSE to be integrated at a regional level in schools. And so what might CSE look like in subjects like social studies, in human and social biology, in home economics, how are gender relations constructed in these subjects and reinforced, and how can we use this to help students to really foster healthy relationships amongst themselves and to see themselves as change makers in this society. So thank you.
Perfect time. It was paining me because a whole community approach, CSE, comprehensive sexuality education, evidence-based, age-appropriate, and you gave us a great example of the incubator. Thank you, Ashley. Cavell, what solutions can we implement to put research into practice to recognize the fullness of women's economic participation? Where the woman was a question asked on the panel, and to pull more women from informality into formality in the Caribbean?
Thank you very much, Tony, for your question. It's a great question. I believe one key solution to improve women's economic participation in the Caribbean and to move women from informal jobs to more formal jobs, stable jobs, is for governments to design laws and policies to address gaps in early childcare services in the region. An adequate childcare policy should have 3 pillars. 1, availability. 2, affordability. And 3, quality. In terms of availability, gaps exist in most of the Caribbean, as many countries do not have adequate regulatory frameworks for childcare services for children below primary school starting age. To ensure convenience of services, childcare laws should regulate the hours of operation that should at minimum accommodate the needs of parents working full-time. Options for governments in the Caribbean to expand access to childcare can be grouped into 4 main approaches. So these are solutions or approaches that governments in the Caribbean can incorporate. 1, they can either do a direct government provision, which means that the government provides childcare services, and we've seen this being implemented in countries like France and Sweden. Or 2, financial support to families through tax breaks, rebates, allowances, or vouchers. 3, incentives for non-state provisions, such as grants to help set up early childcare centers where there may be gaps in rural communities in particular. And 4, employer-supported childcare. An increasing number of countries are placing at least some obligation of childcare on employers once they have a certain number of employees. The second aspect is affordability. Even when formal childcare is available, affordability of care is a central concern. When childcare services are offered at a cost, fee regulations, including fee gaps, may be a way to promote affordability for parents by preventing providers from setting costs above the accepted levels. Colombia is the only country in the region where fees set by public providers cannot exceed 6% of the value of the monthly legal minimum wage. And finally, quality. Quality childcare improves children's development outcomes. Teacher-to-child ratios, for example, are an important structural quality aspect, as lower teacher-to-child ratios allow children to receive individual attention, and teachers can more effectively cater to diverse learning needs. The law
so, Cavell, you have one more to go for us. So give us that one more as well,
yes.
Please.
To ensure quality teaching services for children under primary school age, governments within the region must ensure that these early learning practitioners are adequately paid. The reality is that these are often underpaid professional groups. And so therefore, that is my final synopsis on the legal reforms that are needed to address childcare gaps in the Caribbean. Thank you.
Excellent. You hit all of the nails on the head. Thank you so much for that, Cavell. Amilcar, what solution do you propose for partnership to gender equality in the government, in development agencies, in academia, men and boys, and policymakers?
I think the regional development space needs a Caribbean boys and men's platform for peace and action. It must apply a gender transformative approach to peace and security in support of the declaration of the heads of government on crime and violence as a public health issue. Though regional in its framework, the platform is meant to be implemented through national security ministries and the gender machinery at the country level. The Caribbean Boys and Men Platform for Peace and Action recognizes that gender inequality is one of the root causes of crime and violence in Caribbean societies at social and structural levels. This platform is aligned with 3 action pillars in the CDB's gender equality policy and operational strategy. 1, economic empowerment of all. 2, education and training for all. And 3, eliminating gender-based violence for all. Some key objectives on this platform are to design a curriculum to redress harmful social norms, to effectively provide psychosocial services and health services to boys and men to improve health-seeking behaviors and access to care, to establish a network for boys and men to promote peace and gender equality. This network will enable peer-to-peer learning, exchange, and leadership as a counter to the influence of gangs. Then develop a pathway for young men not in employment or formal educational training to have second and third opportunities to O-level certificate completion. This enhances literacy and numeracy skills for employment and entrepreneurship. And last, promote social solidarity through community service. This service will also be aligned with the sustainable management of community centers, public spaces, and agro-processing sites and farms through the network of boys and men to promote peace and gender equality. The Caribbean Boys and Men Platform for Peace and Action will put a dent in the ad hoc approach to male programming that has been prioritized in the contemporary social and gender and development landscape. This platform will also acknowledge without apology or hesitation the harms of patriarchal power relations in Caribbean societies and its dreadful role in shaping the ideals of masculinity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amilcar. So this platform, peer-to-peer learning, addressing the social norms. And I know this morning, Trinidad and Tobago, with the Government of Canada and UN Women, just launched its process to develop a women peace and security plan. This is fantastic. Daniel, as Cavell was saying, and you said you're a young father, or your minister said you're a young father, I will claim being a young mother as well. The solution she gave about affordability for the child care was also critical to ensuring that women are fully engaged in the economy. And we do want to thank the Government of Canada for their investment in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Caribbean in particular, on building back Equal to really address this care economy work. So this could have been a panel in and of itself. We fast-forwarded. But really, next time we want to ask these colleagues to be on a panel, because clearly the future of the Caribbean is in good hands with these young experts.
Thank you, Tony. Wow, that was a tour de force. Thank you so much to our young people. Thank you so much to our youth. And we had quite a bit there just now from the solutions room. I think the solutions room brought solutions, and we need to respond. But before we respond, we're going to turn to our audience here in-house, and we're going to jump straight to the Q&A session. We have heard quite a bit this afternoon thus far. Before we come back to our expert panel for wrap-up, I'm sure there may be a few burning questions within the audience. And so I want to open the floor at this time for anyone who may have a question at this time for our panelists, or anything that you may have heard thus far. Please, we have microphones on either side. I see one hand. I see two hands. So we have microphones on either side of the room. Just please go to, yeah, you can both go. They're two mics. We just ask in the interest of time, please, to make your questions fairly succinct and snappy and direct. Please.
It's good afternoon. It's not so much of a question, but more a solution. And I'm sure that the bank is aware of this very innovative treaty that the Latin American and the Caribbean region has recently signed, which is known as the Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation, and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, commonly known as the Escazú Agreement. And when I listened to the panelists here this evening, and also those in the solutions room, I recognized that the goal that, that they are, and the solutions that they are offering is very much in line with that agreement. This agreement is an environmental agreement as well as a human rights agreement. And it's a wonderful tool for us to accomplish the Sustainable Development Goals, of which SDG 5 is one, which is gender equality, which is what we are talking about here today. So here's what I want the bank to do, and I'm imploring the bank to do. There are two main ways that we think that the bank can assist in the agreement, and the agreement secretariat is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean.
I'm going to give you 30 more seconds. I'm going to give you 30 more seconds.
And we want to see the bank form partnerships to, one, develop the voluntary fund of that. And the second thing is towards the human rights defenders, the protection of human rights defenders. And at the moment, we are putting together an action plan for that. So we want to see a partnership between the CDB and that agreement for us to see these two things move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Fortunately, you're about to walk past our division chief for social sector, Dr. Baptiste. You're sitting right behind him, actually, so he will follow up on that for us. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Nelsia Robinson, and I want to begin by saying that I am a gender-based violence survivor. I'm standing in the room, and I want to acknowledge that, because many times we talk of GBV, and the people who are affected are not there. The research has been done on them, right? So I want to show that survivor will come out, can come out with the necessary supports. So for me, there is not enough support towards the people, both the perpetrators and those who were affected. That is number one. The other thing is, I have worked in so many different NGOs and CSOs, and what is very clear to me now, that we cannot depend on voluntarism right through. There was a time when you volunteer and you have your full job. But now it appears that there is not the time and there's not the will to continue this work. There is not enough resource to keep those grassroots organizations on the ground that will supply the things that Ms. Nicole talked about, Michelle talked about, because these are so very essential, towards development. And finally, in terms of really going forward, we need to pay attention to health. I do not think, from what I heard, that the health of the people, enough is generated about it. I am representing the indigenous community here today as a Garifuna, not only in Belize, from St. Vincent and the Grenadines as well. And Garifuna indigenous people have a problem getting their craft and so on marketed towards being developed and having that economic source that they should have. I think that when we are talking about disasters, we think only of the floods and the earthquakes and so on. One of the greatest disasters is the loss of the sense of self. And when people begin to be proud of what they are doing, that arises, and there is the desire to learn more and to contribute more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We recognize and applaud your contribution.
Thank you. I have a straightforward question. Sure. Gender inequality is a multidisciplinary intersectional matter, i.e. social, educational, cultural, financial, economic. In view of the panelists, what would be the best approach to ensure more results, to be more impactful, and so resolve the gaps of gender inequality in the Caribbean region? Thank you.
Thank you. Nicole, we were supposed to come back to you, so I'm going to ask you to take that one.
Thank you. So I say thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to frame that around a couple of areas, right? So what we really need, and we've heard some discussion about it, is transformational change. Transformational change that is driven by transformation in organizational culture. So again, as I said, where are the women? Where is that gender balance within the organization? Also transformational change that actually ensures that there is a measurable impact in terms of addressing gender inequality, and that we are not approaching the whole issue of gender inequality as one where we're, subsuming gender neutral impacts, or, on the other hand, we need to be sensitive and responsive. We need to focus on that intersectionality. We need to support the grassroots, as this our other colleague from the field just spoke about from the audience. And I would like to also put forward that we need to ensure deliberate actions in terms of gathering and using that data for analysis in terms of informing decision making, right? Capacity building and training. One of my particular areas of interest is access to finance. So capacity building and training for those within the financial institutions to make them gender sensitive and gender aware that the financial products and services that they offer are not in fact gender neutral, right? Also, we spoke about the importance of collective action towards, in one case, gender responsive financing. We also need to ensure transparency on gender related impacts. That can also include transparency in gender pay gap. You know that in the UK, they actually have to report annually at the company level in terms of what their levels are in terms of the disparity in terms of gender pay gaps. And we need to also work, to answer your question, I think somewhat of a response to your question, to ensure workforce diversity and inclusion practices. We see that there are some measures that we're aware of, such as UN Women WEPs. We need to not have those as tools or frameworks that are kind of like over there, nice things to do, but actually integrate them into our corporation so that we can actually begin to make measurable changes.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Judith, I think you want to come in on this.
What Nicole said, in response to the gentleman that asked that question, I'd like us to think about the fact that gender inequality historically is systematic and institutionalized in this space. So we could continue to train women and men, but if the systems themselves are not transformed to be no longer systematically and gender offensive, they're not gender equal, they don't promote gender equality. That's been with us a long time. So that has to be a conscious effort, has to be made to undo that, so that the persons, when the individuals become gender sensitive and gender responsive and they're ready to go, the systems and the institutions don't hold them back.
Okay, so thank you. Sure.
Judith and Nicole share. I think from a financial institution's perspective, sometimes what does gender equality look like is a difficult question to answer in that space. For us, not so much. So I can share, we've heard from Nicole and Judith some examples. And I think very simply, how do we know that we have not achieved gender equality across our region? We can ask ourselves very simple questions. Are our countries violence-free? Are our countries poverty-free? Are all of the citizens in our countries exercising and receiving their rights? Are our children, all of our children accessing education? Are all of our folks accessing adequate health care. And I think, unfortunately, the answer to all of those is no thus far, and that's how we know, right? And so there's a way that once we improve development holistically for everyone in a way that honors, respects our values, our culture, our institutions that we've created and we respect and build, and breaks down these systematic forms of oppression that we are aware of, these forms of inequality that are aware of, that's how we know that we cannot have gender equality if we still have inequality across all of these systems.
Absolutely, absolutely. Michelle.
I want to switch a little, and I want to talk to Ms. Robinson, who gave her input. I am from Dangriga, from the Garifuna community in Dangriga, and some of the challenges that exist with women and what happened, and for us as a Caribbean on a whole to rethink how we see our population, how we see our indigenous communities, and what wealth of experiences they have: herbal medicines, craft, music, dance, the stories that are embedded in our culture. And so I think it's time for us to actually reframe how we do business. You know, it's easier to do business. We could get something from Amazon, but you can't get a Garifuna drum here to St. Lucia in 10 days. But we could get it from anything from China, you say, right? My colleague said that, not me, so, but her. But you understand what I am saying. We don't place value on those things that are for us, from us, and let it represent in all the spaces that we have. So I just wanted to add to that, and thanks very much for her intervention and continued advocacy.
Sure, sure. Halima, I'm going to give you the last word on the panel.
Thanks, Daniel. I was really enjoying listening to everyone. I also want to acknowledge Nelsia, who is an inspiration to me, one Vincentian to another. But just to say that, to underscore the point about honoring who we are and honoring the history of the Caribbean, our work in social justice, advocacy, and development work and planning and progress has always been with us, preceded global organizing, and we've been very much a part of that. So what we call SDGs today, we have been fighting for centuries in the Caribbean. It's who we are. It is how our Caribbean developed in the first place. So I wanted to honor that. I also wanted to say that I was very, very inspired by some of the ideas coming from the solution room. I would want to say to Ashley in relation to gendered violence and her advocacy for comprehensive sexuality education. We see some of that work happening in very nuanced ways in the region. So CDB funded in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for instance, a gender-based violence, gender relations and gender-based violence curriculum for the health and family life education program to be taught at the technical and vocational schools. Why this is important: at the time we stopped health and family life education teaching at the third form level. And for a group of young people, they spoke to us and they said to us, we miss not having health and family life education because these are the skills it gave us. And they were very engaged in terms of the sexuality education, the education on gender relations and gender-based violence, skills-based education learning by doing. So that what you talked about in terms of the preventative work, what you talked about in terms of organizing. And the final thing I will say is that the fiscal space really does need to be provided to ensure that when we come up with these intersectoral, multisectoral, community, cross-space planning, they are resourced. We have a number of gender-based violence and gender policies, gender-based violence action plans and gender policies in the region. They are not fully resourced. They are sometimes not at all resourced. And outside of resourcing these plans and these time that we spend with civil society, with governments, with private sector planning, if they're not resourced, they go nowhere. So just thanks for this space, and it was really inspirational just hearing from everyone, actually. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. So I thought we covered quite a bit of ground this evening. And I want to take a moment, it is my singular honor really at this time to thank our panelists. Please, put your hands together for our panelists. Thank you. I want to thank our speakers who are in the solutions room. I want to thank you, the audience. Certainly, I want to thank the CDB planning team, the UN Women Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean, my fellow moderator, Tony, the Government of St. Lucia and Bureau of Gender Affairs, all of the work that went in, certainly, to pull in this event together. Give yourselves a round of applause, please. So what happens after this seminar? We've heard a lot. A lot has been explored and unpacked this evening. I want to invite you all, and certainly all joining online, to join us on our stories and solutions journey. Look out for the upcoming official launch of the bank's Gender Equality Knowledge Exchange Lab for the Caribbean. That's right, CDB will be launching a Gender Equality Knowledge Exchange Lab for the Caribbean. We are walking the talk. We're not just talking the talk. So the knowledge that we heard here this evening, we will continue with this. So thank you for joining us as we partner to end gender inequalities together. But remember, the journey continues. Thank you. Thank you.